All right. Hello and welcome everybody to a special edition of the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rich, here with our first and very frequent guest, Mayor Dr. Peter Schwartzman. Hello, sir. How are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Good to see you, David.
You as well. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. All right. So we were hoping to have like a live audience here, but I guess people weren't interested in learning about this very important issue. So we're just gonna like do like we're doing a Green Party show. So we already have two people online watching, at least two people that I can see. So that's cool. Welcome to the show. Why don't you go off and start off with just telling us about like the general notion of what climate change is, and then kind of move on to the sense of urgency involved with what's going on right now.
Well, let me just say, one of the things I'll ask the audience is what is the most incredible event to occur during your lifetime? What's the most incredible event to occur during your lifetime? I asked that of my students this past term, and they're looking at me like, they don't know. And I said, well, in their case, I said it happened this week, and they said, what? And then at the time, I think there was, I think someone slapped somebody in the face on TV. That was some of the answers were along those lines. I said, no, it's a little bit more significant than that. And they didn't know. Not one student in my class of 29 knew the answer.
Are you talking about the NOAA recent measure of carbon PMs?
Well, and that's you're getting warm, just like the Earth. But
No pun intended.
yes, sir. Actually, it actually occurred around third week of March, and it was a very bizarre heat wave that struck both the Arctic and the Antarctic simultaneously, and both of them had temperatures 50 to 70 degrees above normal.
Crazy.
Okay.
Crazy.
So when we talk about temperature increases of 1 or 2 degrees as being catastrophic on the planet, imagine temperature swings of 50 to 70 degrees. We're talking about, something that even science fiction books would not even touch because it'd be too unrealistic. And that it took, honestly, it took most mainstream media in the United States about 3 days to cover that story.
Yeah.
I think they had their head in the sand like most of the time, or they were incredulous about it, or frankly, it seems like a normal thing these days. Well, how many tornadoes hit Washington, D.C. today? Oh, 12. Oh, well, that's less than yesterday. So we're good, right?
I guess we're okay. Numbers are going down.
Yeah. So, and as a climatologist, having graduated from the University of Virginia back last century, and been studying climate change and related topics for 30 plus years, I can tell you that this is extraordinary. I mean, this captured my attention like no other event ever. And it was a one-time thing, but it's a warning. If I think it's a warning, it's a major warning. And unfortunately, most people don't know the answer to the question, so therefore it didn't happen, right? And so that's where I start this dialogue tonight, because I think the gravity of the situation is really severe, and yet we're kind of like on the Titanic playing shuffleboard, looking at the iceberg and taking photographs of it.
That's a good analogy, actually.
It really is, and for a person who teaches environmental studies for the last 24 years, it's disturbing. It's quite disturbing. Now, having said all that, okay, so we absorb it. Oh wow, you look at the iceberg, and then someone shows you that most of the iceberg is below water, and you're, oh man, we got to change the direction of the ship, and so that's what I'm mostly interested in talking about tonight, is that we can do it. So let me just throw out some basic concepts, just for the record. Okay.
Yeah.
What do we know? What do we know right now as of 2022? We know that greenhouse gases in the atmosphere control the Earth's temperature. In fact, prior to the anthropogenic sources, they've been warming the Earth about 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's good, because that's allowed life to evolve and persist on Earth for so many millennia. However, it's been relatively constant, especially over short periods of time. And so but the point is that what's in the atmosphere controls our temperature. And that's not something humans knew probably more than 100 years ago. Next, the levels of greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere today are higher than they've been in millions of years. Okay.
Yeah.
And in fact, in CO2 case, for instance, when Thomas Jefferson was walking around, the parts per million was about 270, and now we're over 415. Okay. So
421 was the last number I saw.
Right. And it depends on what month of the year, you measure. There is some oscillation, but it is. Yeah. So it's gone up. It hasn't doubled yet, but it's getting close. And that's just one greenhouse gas. We've got methane, we've got nitrous oxide, we have CFCs, we have other greenhouse gases as well. Now, why is this? Why is this that these gases are in the atmosphere at levels unprecedented in human history? And that's because humans are basically taking carbon out of the ground where it's stable and burning it into the atmosphere. That's why it is. It's very simple. You can teach this to kindergartners. We should, right? We should, but we don't. But we should, and we could. So I really want to make it clear. The things I'm talking about are very easy to understand. And we call them fossil fuels for a reason. They were fossilized organisms that have been buried for millions of years, and now we humans figured out, oh wow, we could burn this stuff, and it heats our homes, and we convert it into electricity, and so on. But that's why we have this situation. And lastly, what we know is increased global temperatures of a mere few degrees will wreak havoc on life on Earth, including humans. Okay, so that's what we know, right? And I mean, I have slides. I didn't, I was prepared to show them. If you have asked questions, I may show you them. But we know that what happened in March with the two extreme temperatures in both poles. I think of that human-wise. Like when we're sick, what happens? We get a headache or a temperature, and our feet tend to get cold, right? It's kind of like the two opposite extremes. Our bodies do almost the opposite thing. But that's a signal. It's a signal to us. It's like how our body speaks to us. And so I think the Earth is speaking to us too. Now, drought. We know drought is, at least in the United States in particular, it's been persistent now for over 10 years. Most of the West has been perpetual drought. I have slides to show. It's called the Palmer Drought Index. People can look it up. And you see extreme red throughout much of the West. And we hopefully know that most of our vegetables come from that part of the world. Okay. And when there's no rain, we haven't learned how to grow vegetables without water yet. I think, some scientists are working on that. And I say that in jest because, of course,
I was going to say, okay.
There was a comic thing I saw on TV the other day where the interviewer asked some people, said, what year did the first person land on the sun? And people are contemplating the answer to that question, right? Not realizing that any spaceship we would send anywhere close to the sun would vaporize long before we reach the sun, right? So it's a similar kind of question. Let's grow vegetables without water, okay? And we're not going to be able to do it, right? So that's the point. The IPCC report 2022. We're in the 6th month of the year. Most people didn't even know it was released because there's more important things to worry about, right? And the media we've heard about the IPCC to the sea often enough, so they don't want to talk about it. They want to talk about the Ukraine war. They want to talk about the latest tweet from our former president. They want to talk about the latest scandal in Washington, whatever. That's what's going to drive media, not what the latest IPCC report says. But as you know, and we've talked about previously on the show, everyone in the world should read it and read it closely. It's not very long. The policymaker summary is like 37 pages, and most of that is just names of authors and such. So there's about 15 pages if you really want to look at the heart of it. And it tells us the gravity of the situation. And it tells us also that we've been doing IPCC reports now for 30 years. And It's a conservative organization, believe it or not. I mean, I've been following it through my graduate school, through my teaching. It's a fairly conservative organization, but yet the pronouncements are becoming more dire, right? The scientific evidence is pointing us into worse and worse scenarios, not less serious ones, but worse ones. And that's not, we didn't know that. The climate system is complex, and so there's reasons to think that other things might take precedent or have power. So that's something to understand. Now, those are the things we know. Those are the knowns. Now, what don't we know? Because I think it's really important to understand what we don't know often.
Absolutely.
And maybe there's some humility that comes from that. The irreversibility of some changes. So we know that the coral reefs are dying out. Are they going to come back in anyone's lifetime? We don't know. We suspect not, but we don't know. How about the dead zones in the Gulf and increasingly in other parts of the planet? Do we know if those are reversible changes or not? We do not. Okay. Very importantly, we don't know the impact of tipping points and feedbacks. And this is something that's really lost on a general population because these are not things commonly taught. But a feedback is when something happens and then the output becomes the input to further generate the output.
Right. No, we studied that in system science, the recursive systems. A causes B, B causes C, C goes back and causes A to do something other, which causes B to do something, and it's a feedback loop, right?
Exactly. And there's so many A, B's, and C's in the system, right?
Right.
So it's a complex system, and we don't know how those feedbacks are going to function. So that's something we don't. But the tipping points to me is probably the most critical. The Gulf Stream keeps Europe habitable for humans. If the Gulf Stream shuts down, guess what Europe becomes? It becomes an ice sheet. Even within a climate change, global warming scenario. Okay. And that means that the ice doesn't melt. That's what it means. And of course, that would change the population of Europe and Europe as a destination, except maybe for skiing. But that's a real possibility. Okay. There's something called moulins. And I'm not talking about Moulin Rouge here. I'm talking about moulins, which is probably a new term. And what we found by accident is when we were in the Arctic and particularly in the Antarctic, we noticed, and in Greenland, I should say, when I say the Arctic, we noticed that there are these puddles of water on the surface. And not only are they puddles, but those puddles descend deep into the dark crevices below. And we're learning now that some of those crevices descend all the way down to the bottom where the ice meets the land.
Wow.
And that could be a destabilizing force. So the thought in the 1990s was, Greenland, Antarctica, they're just huge volumes of ice. And yes, you can melt a little bit on the top, but you're not going to melt the entire sheet. Well, now we have to understand that understanding was naive, and that these moulins may bring warm water down to the barrier and cause the whole entire ice sheet to just move off into water. And that's irreversible. I mean, if a large ice sheet, as we've seen, large ones sizes of states have been falling into the ocean, when that becomes a repeated event, we're going to have sea level rise unlike anything you've ever seen. And there are pictures out there. These are not doomsday kind of apocalyptic. I mean, they might be apocalyptic in some way, but they are realistic in the sense, if you lose the Greenland ice sheet or significant portions of the Antarctic ice sheet, you're going to see, majority of Florida, it goes bye-bye. Wow. Well, I mean, it becomes a underwater retreat. Okay. So, people can live maybe with mass and scuba gear, and that, maybe people like that. And mermaids may actually become real.
We will finally discover Atlantis.
Those of us who can survive. So I've talked for a while, but
just want to look. Yeah, there's some people over here in the comments section.
Wonderful.
David Schwartzman, is that your brother?
That's my father. He's actually watching.
Okay. He says, "I am now the one watching." Thank you, Mr. Schwartzman, for joining us. Andrew Bryan, what was that about dead zones? You want to talk about dead zones a little bit more?
Yeah. So okay. So the most well known one is off the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, off the where just east and south of New Orleans. That the Mississippi River dumps into that part of the Gulf and carries all the nitrates from all of the monoculture cropping that goes on in the Midwest, where we live in the Illinois. Those nutrients that we put, those, and they're fossil fuel fertilizer, by the way. They're made from fossil fuels, so we put them on the land to let the corn and soybeans grow. Well, a lot of it erodes and goes into the river, and then it goes down the river, which flows southward and into the Gulf Stream. That's been going on for decades. Well, over time, that water becomes not habitable for life. It has too many nutrients in it, and it actually it creates a dead zone, an area where there's not enough oxygen for things to live, and it's just pollution at its extreme. And not I'm talking about the sort of fertilizers, but along everybody should know, right, along Louisiana, that's called Cancer Alley because of the petrochemicals industries that line the entire area of Mississippi prior to it reaching New Orleans. And that's also going straight into the Gulf. So there's a lot of death, and that dead zone's been growing and growing every year, and you can see it from satellite. You can see the discoloration of the water. Now, that's also an area which was recently, not too recently, but the Deepwater Horizon episode where there was a break in the oil line from below, and it just leached huge amounts, the largest toxic release of oil into the environment ever. And I think that was about 10 years ago now, but we often forget that. So, you have, and then of course, how did we solve that problem? Supposedly we were going to disperse the oil with fumigants, dispersants, I should say, and those are toxic as well. So, toxic, add the toxic, add the toxic. I mean, it's kind of a nonsensical way of doing things. So that's one dead zone, but there are other zones in the world, particularly as we become more globally dominated by agro business and GMOs and the consequential use of different pesticides as well as fertilizers, which are derived directly from fossil fuels. So we're pumping oil into our fields, and that oil then returns into the ocean where it causes dead zones. Now, this shouldn't, I mean, relatedly, but often conflated, is this idea that we have large zones within the ocean now of plastic pollution, called the giant gyres, they call them. So in the Pacific Ocean, there are places in the middle of the ocean that collect plastics in very high concentrations. And it's unbelievable. I mean, there are places in the ocean right now that have 6 times more plastic in them than biological life. Okay. And a huge realization that occurred this year that people should be paying attention to is we now have definitive proof that we have microplastics in our bloodstream.
Oh, charming.
Okay. And I believe my students heard that one, I was glad to know. But you remember when we were young, they would cut up some birds and they'd see or turtles, and they'd find, candy wrappers right. That's what we saw. And that should have been a warning, right? That was the canary in the coal mine. Wow, if these birds have these things in their bodies, what do we have in our bodies? And we didn't make that connection. Hopefully now we will, because we could test each other's blood. And that was my next point. What we don't know is the collective impact of all the human activities. So we can focus on climate change, but what about the plastics that have been entered in the environment? What about the GMOs that continue to be utilized? What about 5G, which is the electromagnetic waves, microwaves that now are becoming mainstream throughout the world, right? Particularly in urban areas. We have hundreds of thousands of new chemicals that are being, 100,000 is kind of the rough number of new petrochemically, most of them derived chemicals that are being released in the environment because they make plastic a certain softness or not. They make other structures perhaps more sturdy. They make pills edible. Things like this. And yet we just keep adding more and more chemicals to the system. And the last thing I think we don't know, and we sort of know, but we don't know, is how leaders and people will respond or behave when things get worse, right? And so, what do people do? What do leaders do when resources are limited? When fires burn down forests? When water is not available? When a pandemic hits a community? These are things we know through history, but what we don't know is how they're going to be responding now. And so that creates a lot of stress in our population. Here's what I've learned, though. And I'm glad my father's on the call. He and I wrote a book published about 3 years ago now called "The Earth Is Not for Sale." And in that book, we outline that food and energy are the keys to the prosperous future. And when I say food and energy, I mean that there are ways to produce food and energy in sufficient quantity and of proper nutrient without overwhelming the planet, and to ensure that every human being has the nutrients they need and the energy that they need to thrive. We know that. Now, why are we not doing that now? Well, because we don't have enough renewable energy in our system, and we are using, as I've noted, agro industry through agriculture, petrochemical agriculture, as opposed to agroecology. And we can talk about this. I know you yourself have quite a bit of background. So we have food and energy. We know these are known ways to do these things so that we can provide enough. We know that. We don't need to invent anything new. That's the amazing thing. Now, we're going to invent new things, sure. But the point I want to stress is we have the technologies today. We have the techniques today. We also need to draw down the greenhouse gases, right? We know how to do that, okay? It takes probably the use of renewable energy to do that. It's called sequestration. But you can change the atmospheric concentration of some of these greenhouse gases through technological efforts. And some of them are using different types of cropping. Some of them have to do with growing new forests and so forth. So it's a multi-tiered approach. And I can talk about that a little bit. It's called Drawdown. And there's a great book by Paul Hawken that addresses this. We need to move quickly, and we need to move with collective determinism. That we know. These are things we know, and that's what I've learned. And lastly, and very importantly, I call it the revolution has begun. But I when I say revolution, it's R-evolution. The revolution has begun. And when I put the R there, because R to me is a very powerful word, a letter that is at the forefront or the starting point of many words that we do to engage in. So recall, recycle, reduce, renew, right? That's the three pillars of environmentalism. But unfortunately, those are not the ones we need to really highlight. They're not bad ones. They should not be rejected. And in many instances, they should be embraced. But they're not sufficient. We need regeneration. And Paul Hawken also has a book on that just came out last fall. I highly encourage folks to look at that book with that title. We need to repair. We need to rejuvenate. We need to recapture. We need to reimagine. We need to reform. We need to be radicalized. So there's a lot of R words that I think could be put in practice, which are much more powerful than reduce, reuse, recycle. To me, those are very relatively passive kind of R's, and we need more animated and active R's. And I'll just highlight one point. When you reduce, reuse, recycle, think about that. It really, the way it's been taught to us, ingrained in us, is okay, I'm going to buy a pair of socks. Okay. Now, hopefully they're made out of something I can recycle so that I don't throw them away. And maybe I can get them secondhand. Right. And maybe I don't need 5 pairs. I can live with 3 pairs. Okay. But notice in all 3 of those contemplations, it's about consumption. It literally turns us into consumers. It only focuses on consumption. And we are more than consumers. I ask my students, what do we do other than consume? And they don't know. They can't come up with anything. That's how powerful our current economic system is in how we think. We think all we do is consume. Think about, what are we going to do now today? What are we going to do? Consume. What are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? Where are we going to go? Spend money? Where are we going to drive? What are we going to buy? That's what we do, right? That's our lives. Okay. That's consumption. I want to hone in on other components, other potentialities of human beings. And that means regenerate. And I ask my students, what would that mean? What does regenerate look like? And it takes them a while. And I'm not blaming them. When I point fingers at them, I got 3 pointed back at me. So when they regenerate, what are we talking about? And after a while, they realized, yeah, okay, that means let's plant trees somewhere in the community. Let's grow our own food. Let's engage in social interactions with people that don't require a consumption, that their focus is not consumption. The focus is on connection, not consumption. So I really think there's a really powerful paradigm shift that is underway in the world, and it's moving us away from consumption to a world where other words, other C words are more vital. So I'll pause there. I have a few more slides to talk about, but I'm more than happy to see what
Nobody's besides the dead zones. It's not specifically questions. It's just your dad said. You mentioned positive feedbacks, negative feedback stabilize. Okay. Andrew Bryan just mentioned that he also heard of that about microplastics in our blood. And then he also wrote the word rejuvenate. I think he was just trying to clarify something he said. But let me ask some stuff here. I had some other guests on the Green Party show, authors of a book called Bright Green Lies, and the initiators of a movement called the Deep Green Resistance. Excuse me, it's a little dry in here. Where their book has stats and charts and all sorts of stuff. It's very rationally assembled. Some of these things I'd have to check for sure, but there's a couple of numbers I didn't buy it. But they think that the environmental or the green movement has kind of lost its way, and that the renewable energy sources in particular are not going to do anything. First of all, if I can summarize the book in a couple sentences here. First of all, it would just simply solar, wind, and hydro won't provide enough energy to meet the need of energy or electricity output that we have now. So that you're going to have to do other things, like you're going to have to build nuclear plants, which is unacceptable, and that kind of thing. B, even if you do rely on renewable sources like solar and wind, there's some inherent inconsistencies in that, because, for example, I saw a picture the other day of 2 maintenance people on a big wind turbine cleaning up the oil that was leaking out of it, that kind of stuff. Okay, so you're still going to need petroleum and fossil fuels to make all this stuff, to perpetuate this stuff, to maintain this stuff. So can you speak to any of that at all?
No, that's great. It's almost like you threw me a softball. In Chicago, they play with the big softball.
I know, the 16 inches.
Yeah. So that I got a bat and
right, good. Knock it out of the park, baby.
Yeah. So no, here's the deal. Okay. This question that you answered or you asked and regarding energy, there were 2 studies that were published in Scientific American on the front page in 2008 and 2009. And this, in fact, was what motivated my father and I to start researching this topic, because in both of those articles and the research behind them, they made it very clear that we could transition to 100% electricity and energy in the world by the end of the century. One of them, in fact, 2009 article made the case for us shifting to 100% electricity and 100% energy, renewable energy and electricity by 2030. So that would have been 21 years later. Now, when my father and I read that article, and my dad was the kind of guy, he got me a lifetime subscription to Scientific American as a basically in diapers. So that was an article he and I both were familiar with. And so we read that, and that was a pretty radical statement to make in 2009, right? And yet, unsurprisingly, it got almost no coverage. I mean, it's shockingly shocking to me, and has been for a long time, that the mainstream media doesn't pick up on these basic things. But he and I were a bit incredulous about it, right? I mean, it sounded too good to be true. So, and whenever anything's too good to be true, you should test it. So my father and I worked.
Isn't true, right? Exactly.
Right. So he and I worked. He has a geology background, geochemistry. I have a physics, environmental science, atmospheric science background. So we worked together, collaborated. It was really our first collaboration, and it was very eye-opening to do that modeling. So we looked at how would we convert our current fossil fuel dominated society into a renewable one, and could it be done, right? And we, in a paper that we published in 2011, which one can find at a website called solarutopia.org. That's where we posted that paper and other papers. We convinced ourselves, yeah, we could transition, as the article in the Scientific American claimed, we could transition to 100% renewable energy in about 20 to 25 years. And we could do it and increase the amount of energy used in the world today, right? And the reason why we need to increase the amount of energy used today is not so you and I have bigger TVs and drive 3 or 4 cars to our name, but rather that the people who are suffering from energy poverty in the world, which is the majority of people on Earth right now, particularly those in India, for instance, many in China, many, virtually, most people in Africa, for instance, and so on, right? These are places that people cannot do basic things like read a book at night because they don't have electricity. Okay. Right. And so we included expansion of their energy production and use, and a reduction, in fact, in ours, because we're extremely wasteful in the West with our energy use. And the United States is the most profligate of all in comparison to other countries. And so we could do a lot better. And I could talk about ways to do that. But long story short, we figured we probably needed about twice the amount of energy we're using in 2011 globally. And we could produce that with 100% wind and solar. We actually discounted some other forms like geothermal. Now, could it be utilized, or hydropower? Could we utilize it? Yes. In some instances, sure. But was it necessary? Probably not. And we definitely were excluding nuclear for probably some of the same reasons that book says it's a false solution. So that's the answer to your first question. And I could talk maybe more about how that modeling worked, but that paper is just a few pages long. I'd encourage anyone.
I mean, that's no, and I'm glad that you said all that too, because I do know that Elon Musk is as much as he's trustworthy, I guess. I mean, I think generally he is. He seems to be, even though he's a billionaire and there's problems with that, like he seems to be he wants to do the right thing. He said that 200,000 square miles, I think, of solar panels would give electricity to the entire United States. He's like, there's a little corner of Utah where there's nothing going on. He's like, just put it there. You can give electricity to everybody in the United States, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and I did similar calculations, and frankly, anyone who wants to meet me or meet online, do a Zoom with me, I'd happy to walk them through those calculations. They're not that complicated. Okay, I mean, you don't have to have a PhD to understand the basic mechanics of how this works. Now, but what needs to be said, of course, it's like, yeah, we can produce all the food, say in Wyoming, for the world, but maybe Wyoming isn't fertile, right? Or we'd have to distribute the food if we did produce the food. And so it's a bit more complicated than just saying, well, there's enough solar energy in Utah. We'd have to get it to everywhere in the world. Now, we think that's definitely doable. Frankly, I mean, for instance, the electricity we're using right now to have this conversation online is probably generated in a different state. It's just, you know, electrons are coming from somewhere. I live closer to Missouri than you, but it's just as likely coming from a nuclear plant in Iowa or maybe in Missouri, you know, that kind of thing. Now, we do produce a lot of electricity in Illinois, so in Illinois, it's more likely coming from Illinois than it is somewhere else. But the point is, you know, we've had transcontinental, I should say, intercontinental electricity for decades, right? For basically everyone's lifetime who's on this call. And you know, how do we do that? Right? Now, it doesn't mean we continue to do it that way. My daughter is actually researching this. She got a fellowship this summer to do research in microgrids. So the idea is each community could produce its own electricity with some solar, with some wind, maybe some hydropower, maybe some geothermal, or maybe some biofuels. I mean, it made, you know, each community is gonna be a little different. There's something called the Solutions Project, which is out of Stanford, and I would highly encourage people to visit that online. They've looked at this very carefully for all states, and they have a breakdown of what percentage of each of these types of renewable energy sources you'd need in order to produce enough electricity for everyone. And the emphasis is we probably are going to move towards an electricity-driven economy. Currently, that's not the case, as it turns out. It's strange to hear this, but
yes.
if you just think of this card, I just happen to have an Uno card here. Assuming this is all the energy you use, right? The electricity that you use, the actual end energy that you use in electricity is only about 12% of this card. All that other energy that you use is either used to produce that electricity, that little sliver. It's actually 4 to 1, roughly. So it takes 4 times as much energy to produce that 1 unit. So that's the 4/10. The other 6/10 are coming from, you know, you're driving your car, you're heating your home with natural gas, the energy that's used on your food to transport it, to grow it, because again, that's fossil fuels based. So the point being, there's 2 things I emphasize with that. Electricity literally is just a small portion of all the energy that we use. And so if we convert everything to electricity, guess what happens? That 40% that we use to get 10%, that 30% loss goes away. It's gone. Because it's produced primarily directly as electricity. So when you have a solar panel or wind turbine, you're producing electricity directly. In the case of coal or nuclear, that's not the case, right? You have to extract those things. You have to burn them, or, you know, create some very expensive device to utilize them to get that little electricity that we want. So there's a lot of waste in those other systems. The other 60% that we're using, that's wasted, that's fossil fuel driven, could be significantly reduced through the use of more you know, better transportation, better trains that are run on electricity. Those could be subway systems. Those could be buses. Those could be bicycles. Those could be cars, obviously. But the more, you know, more efficient ways to move people around the world, or stuff, can be done much more effectively and efficiently than we do today. Because in a sense, and I hope the listeners know this, right? The biggest subsidies in the world go to the fossil fuel industry.
Oh yeah.
And so we basically, through our taxes, pay them to maintain these so-called low oil prices. So when the price of oil is going up now, you know, gasoline $6 a gallon in some places, you know, people are in shock. They shouldn't be in shock at all. I mean, realistically, these are the prices that Europeans have been paying for decades, because their oil is not nearly as subsidized as ours. And so now, why they're so at $6, and you know, is it because of the war? I think it's an excuse, personally.
Sure.
But you know, we're getting gouged because we're still paying the subsidies, and we're getting gouged at the pumps as well. So we're getting double gouged, and there's not enough understanding of these issues to really mount a corrective measure, which would be to get rid of fossil fuels. That's the measure. and we can do that. We know how to do that. And if you ever seen the movie Who Killed the Electric Car?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
It's a fantastic movie.
Yeah, I know I need to. Yeah, for sure.
And it proves, definitively speaking, without doubt, that we could have had electric cars. Now, I'm not a big fan of electric cars like mass produced all over the world. I'm not a big fan of that, just so you know. Public transportation is the answer. But we could have had cars that got 300 miles on a charge 10, 15, 20 years earlier than we did.
Oh, yeah.
Now, absolutely. One last point. So I have a coin here. I like to carry it around because it really, let me see if I have the orientation right. This coin was used in the 1920s in Galesburg, Illinois. For what? What would a coin like this be used for? It was used for an electric trolley. So we had electric trolleys running in our city, which then was, the population was probably 10,000 people back in 1920 something. And guess what? The major industries colluded. And and Galesburg was the first city in the United States to have its trolley removed. It was a trial, and it was the companies involved, the oil companies, the car companies, the tire companies, the bus companies, the trucking industry. They colluded to ensure that we have individualized cars. We do not have collective public transportation. And here's the other irony. I've talked about reinstating trolleys in Galesburg. And people look at me like I'm living in a cave. Like, what a foreign concept. We're way beyond trolleys. Or they'll say on the opposite extreme, oh, we can't afford it. It's way too expensive. And I'm like, really? So we had enough money in 1920 in Galesburg to have trolleys, but somehow 100 years later, with all this extra wealth that we have in our community, all this extra farm wealth, we can't afford it. And that, honestly, this is a slide that I was going to show you. There's two things I've been reminded of recently, and I want to stress this. And I'm going to share my slide if you don't mind.
No, I don't.
Now, how do I do this with? Okay, I'm going to share this one slide because it's just got to be shown. My words can only be that. No, I don't want to do that. Why did it ask me to do that? One last try. Yeah, we're going to do this. Can you see my screen now?
I still see you.
How about now?
Nope.
You don't see my screen?
Nope.
Why is that? Oh, I see why. I see why. We're going to do this. We're going to be good. Here we go. So here's my screen. Okay, you see it now?
Yeah, I got to add it though. Hold on. There you go.
Okay, so I've been reminded of the following. We have all the money we need. We have all the money we need. I feel like that has to become the new mantra. Now, how do I know we have all that money we need? Check this out. This is the total wealth of countries as of 2019. Notice the wealth of the United States is $106 trillion. That's only 30% of the world's wealth. Notice all the other wealth. So you multiply that by 3. We have over $300 trillion of wealth in this world. So we have the money. Another way we know we have the money, check this out. This is how much we spent in 2021 on the military. Notice the United States spent $800 billion during a pandemic on the military. China was far behind at $300 billion. India, UK, Russia. Notice Russia's expenditures on military is less than 1/10 what we spent. So you add up all that money. We spend well over $1 trillion, approaching $2 trillion on the military. The next thing I learned or have been reminded of is that nature can heal and regenerate. I really think we need to look to nature for guidance. Cooperation, reciprocity is dominant principle among plants. This is something the biologists didn't recognize until very recently. And that is, trees on one side of my house are actually sharing nutrients with trees on the other side of my house. Amazing, right?
Yeah.
Maybe people on one side of my house should be sharing resources with the people on the other side of my house. And a good example of this is this cushion plant. So this is a new plant I'd like to introduce you to. It lives in the coldest parts of the world, where there isn't much by way of active soil. So these plants have learned how to adapt to that. And what they do is they collect dust from the atmosphere and they use it as nutrients to grow on rocks. And once they have set up, as you see here, kind of a colony, this allows other plants to begin growing. And so to me, this is like life on another planet, but it's on our planet. And, to me, this is a sign that if some of us can get our act together and create a nurturing, loving environment, then other humans can join. So I'll stop
Very
sharing.
cool. All right. Yeah, that's
And
cool.
I think that's a very hopeful thing to think about. There's just an amazing amount of research that we don't have time to get into, but people should look at the power of plants to heal. There's evidence now, strong evidence that trees in particular can expand a person's life. If you put trees in front of people's homes and they grow up in that environment, they're more likely to live longer than if they didn't have those trees. Right. Even healing that goes on within hospitals. If a person can see a tree from their hospital bed, they're going to recover faster than if they didn't. And I know that sounds really hokey. And I went to Virginia Tech, so I am a hokey person for 2 years. But I mean, I want to impress. My point in mentioning this is to impress upon us humans that we have so much more to learn from nature, that we have barely scratched the surface. And if we could adopt principles and values of plants, we're going to live more in harmony with each other and with the planet.
That is very true. Very well said. And let me go over some of these things in the comments section. They're building up here. I know Andrew was asking about nuclear power. He thinks that from a physics standpoint, nuclear would be more reliable. He doesn't understand why nuclear energy is frowned upon. Maybe you can spend a moment talking about that real quick. Hendrika Regis is asking if you could post a link to the paper that you were referring to earlier.
Yeah, that's solarutopia.org.
Let me put that in there.
That's easy to find.
Solarutopia.org. Okay, so I put it in the comments section there, Hendrika. Your dad mentioned, okay, so yeah, he knows what's up. Eco-primitivism, following the lead of Derek Jensen, that's one of the people I had on the show concerning the Bright Green Lies, is a prescription for mass suicide because the necessary renewable energy capacity will not be created for climate mitigation and adaptation. Real quick, I think that he would probably agree with you, but their solution is like they want to go back to pre-agricultural days. Like they think that agriculture is where everything started going downhill, that we shouldn't be planting unless we're using permaculture methods. And so so they don't want. They think that the energy sources that we have now are part of the problem and should go away. Which I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's right. It's definitely not realistic. But whether or not it's necessary. Any thoughts on that? Andrew Bryan is asking, any thoughts on the East St. Louis solar grid in relation to privatization versus community ownership? You can start there.
Okay, though those are good things to talk about. So, as far as nuclear goes, I mean, the basic point is, as far as I'm concerned, I follow the precautionary principle, and therefore there's no need to use a technology that is inherently dangerous, not just in terms of like the use of it, but the storage of it, the geopolitical turmoil that comes about with it. My father says we are pro-nuclear, just the sun 93 million miles away. That's the nuclear that we support. And I would argue the same thing for GMOs. GMOs are not necessary. Sure, they bring riches to the agro industry, but they're not necessary. We don't need them. So why do humans think we're going to play some higher power by putting genes of a fish into a strawberry? Why do we think that makes any sense? And you think I'm joking, but that's being done.
No, I don't. I just think it's
going
funny
on. It's going on every day, and then the companies are hoarding this quote knowledge and then forcing it upon the world. And there's no need to use technologies that are not necessary. That's the point, and particularly ones that are inherently dangerous. And a nuclear power plant, as we saw at Fukushima, Chernobyl, and of the money that I showed you for militarism, how much of that is being spent making nuclear bombs, which we know is not those. They have no function on the world. They have no function. They only create the potentiality for mass extinction. Okay. And, we're all sitting here hoping that Putin doesn't use nuclear weapons. I mean, we're all sitting here. Why are we even worrying about that? We should not have nuclear weapons at all. Okay. So, and yes, nuclear power production is not the same as nuclear weapons, but yet, as an educated person knows, they are precursors. Okay, that the waste can be utilized and reprocessed into a fissile material, which is necessary for nuclear weapons. So anyway, that's why nuclear is not necessary, despite what Mr. Hansen says. Okay, as far as the privatization of solar, one thing I have not discussed at all tonight, and it often doesn't get discussed because we often run out of time. In order to move forward with renewable energy on a global scale, we have to do it with equity in mind. Equity, both in terms of jobs and jobs creation and wealth creation in especially impoverished communities, and that's the case in East St. Louis, one of the most devastated parts of our state. The school district there being underfunded because based on property taxes for decades, and just being abandoned. Right. Literally, there were bridges that they would not let people walk over into Missouri. Right. So that's environmental racism. That's structural racism. These are serious issues. So in order for, how do we deal with that equity issue in East St. Louis? We train people there to fix and repair and install the turbines and then the solar panels. And that's the CEJA bill, CEJA, which was passed in Congress in Illinois the end of last year, is one of the most progressive bills on renewable energy that's ever been passed in the United States history. And it passed, and guess how much attention it got in my local newspaper? Exactly. That's as much. And I went to my students again and asked them, has anybody heard what happened this week? It was pretty outstanding. Nobody knew, right? So, but the reason why it was such an effective bill was not just that it's going to invest a lot of money in renewables, but that it's going to mandate that there are schools created in impoverished areas so that people can get jobs in these industries. We know renewable energy is much more productive in creating jobs than fossil fuels. We've known that for decades. So we need to create wealth in these other communities, and this is the way to do it. Now, and CEJA allows that to happen. It mandates it happening. Now, the other part of equity is that the panels are not made in China or somewhere else where environmental laws are non-existent. And so the people who are making the panels are the ones who are dying from the production of them. Wow. Silica, silicon is used to make most of the panels. Silicon is a pretty safe material, except when it is in powder form. And of course, anything of that size, and particularly silica, gets in your body, it causes all kinds of problems. So we know that there's horrific and Derek Jensen could probably outline this as best as anyone, horrific conditions of workers in China and other places who are making these panels. Now, we have to change that, right? We have to create international, respect international laws related to workers and ensure that our panels, or our jeans for that matter, right? So if you see people walking around town with jeans on that are faded, how do you think they got faded? They got faded by human beings who live in a plant, work in a plant, who are basically shaving cotton particles off of the jeans. And then we wear them and they're fashionable, but yet people are dying because of inhalation of that poison. Okay. So we have to stop doing that, right? We have to change the way we manufacture, and we have to demand that our panels are made humanely. Just like fair trade chocolate, we need fair trade panels. So we have to address the equity issues. Now, furthermore, and this is the point that was raised, the privatization. So I am encouraging large companies to come to Galesburg to build large solar plants in and around our community to power the grid. I am encouraging that.
Do you think it's going to happen?
It is happening. Oh, it's happening. We have a $70 million project going in 2024. It's going to produce enough electricity for the entire residential area of Galesburg, 30,000 people. And the expectation is we're going to have 10 more of those facilities within the county within the next 10 years. Yeah, it's going to happen. And that's very impressive. I'm not excited about that. But here's the rub. Here's the rub. The people that are doing that work, who I admire for their pioneering spirit, are still profiting at an extreme level.
Yeah, well.
Okay. And so the point is, if we want a habitable and equitable planet, we've got to find ways to share that wealth. We have to. Okay. Inequity.
Well, I think a lot of people within the green movement or the environmental movement, they would tend to be on the left of politics and economics. Is that what you're pointing at? I mean, just like, capital, if it includes profit, it's from a capitalist system.
Yeah. And my father and I have dealt, challenge, and he's probably typing away at his computer. He and I, he's contemplated this more than I have in many regards, but the point is, do we need capitalism in order to transition? And I would say,
don't you think capitalism kind of caused the problem?
Right. But the agenda would say capitalism in tomorrow, and we start over. I think that's what he would say. I'm not of that view. I think we transition. While we transition, we recognize the need to continually increase local ownership, cooperative types of employment, local production, local control, decentralization. That's what I'm talking about. We need to decentralize the systems that we have: our food, our water, and our energy. If we're able to do that, so it's a question of trajectory, and we have to know what kind of progress we're making. Because if we're not, for instance, if we're not moving towards renewables now, then we're done. We're done, right? I mean, there's going to be mass horrors on this planet beyond what we can imagine within the century if we don't do that. Now we're doing that. We're moving towards renewables on a pretty radical rate. And I'll just point out, I had a slide, and real quickly, and this shocks people because, again, this isn't in the news. For the last 20 years in the United States, we have seen annual growth rates. This is global, but it's similar to the U.S. Wind is up 19% per year over the last 20 years. Solar is up 36% per year every year over the last 20 years. So tremendous growth in these two areas. But is it green? And is it equitable? And the answer is no. For the most part, it's not. So it's not. Is it decentralized? No, most of it's not. So this is the next step. as we introduce the vital, and we even had a couple of cynics in the group that posted that we can't produce enough electricity through renewables. Once we clarify that that's not the case, then in that transition, we can begin decentralizing the system so that we all can live and thrive. It's as simple as that, frankly. We know a lot of the problems that are going on in the United States right now are driven by the incredible wealth and equity that exists in our country. There isn't a country that exists with extreme wealth and equity that doesn't, or inequality, that doesn't show tremendous signs of pain and suffering. Okay, it's inherent to that kind of system. So we have to rectify that. And renewable energy, decentralized renewable energy, local food systems, local food economies can do that. That is a way to do it. How much money do you and I spend on food every week? Let's say it's $100. It's probably more, but let's say it's $100. That's 52 times that. We're spending $5,000 to $6,000 a year on food. Who's getting that money? I guarantee you, most of us it's going to the agribusiness companies. It's not going to the farmers. It's not going to the the workers at the restaurant. It's going to the agribusiness. And so we have to transform that system. And we can do that by buying local food, going to our farmers market, buying food from CSAs, encouraging urban agriculture in your communities. Those are the ways to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And then when I get down to Galesburg, I plan on helping you make that happen. Khosrow Gunbari, who is a friend of mine from back in the day, and it's awesome that you're watching, Khosrow. Thank you. He says, great talk. Thanks to you both. Unfortunately, a lot of people who care about this issue quickly feel overwhelmed and powerless as they learn more about it. That is true. It's literally a global issue. List of practical behavioral changes and action items, local, regional, national, global, should be packaged, branded, marketed, and otherwise shoved down our collective mouths. Hopelessness is the addressable chronic disease of our time. Wow, okay. Profound, my friend. Your father says, and curb GHG emissions at the same time. What is that?
Are you conflating those two, or what are you?
No, so your dad, so that Khosrow said the hopelessness thing. Your dad said, and curb GHG emissions at the same time.
Yeah, curb greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh, okay.
So reduce, So we have to, and that was the point I made at the beginning, right? We recognize, science recognizes that the global temperatures are driven by the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we have to acknowledge that, and we have to, that is the number that should be in the newspaper, not, whether Sears Roebuck went up 2% or whether the Yankees beat the Red Sox, although I'm a big Red Sox fan. Those are not the numbers we need to know every day. What we need to know is, what are we doing about CO2? What are we doing about nitrous oxide? What are we doing about employment in our communities? What are we doing about equitable wealth transfer? What are we doing about local food systems? Those are the numbers. And here's another number. How many birds are in your community? How many grasshoppers? How many elm trees? Those are the numbers we need to know. Because if we don't know those numbers, and most communities are not recording those numbers or communicating them in any significant way, we will continue to lose the backdrop of our, or the foundation of our life systems. And we won't even notice. And this is a really important point. I know we're a little bit over time, but I will say the following. Like, people don't understand how we can be overusing the planet because the assumption is, well, the planet has to give, so we're just taking what the planet has to give. And so how can we be overusing what's there? Well, what they don't understand is there's a difference between endowment, right, and wealth. Okay, and so income. I'm sorry, endowment and income difference. Right. So your soil might be this thick, right? Mm-hmm. Well, every year you take soil, you can still grow food until you get to the bottom and there's no more food. Right. So that's the point I'm trying to make. If we do not fully understand that, if we don't recognize that our aquifers that feed the plants that grow our farm crops in the Midwest, if we don't understand that, if we don't know that that's being depleted, we're not going anywhere. If we don't know our soils are being depleted, Washington and Mississippi, if we don't recognize that, if we don't understand that, tremendous amount of loss of life due to air pollution and cancer and other diseases, which are preventable, largely preventable, with the proper type of nutrition and clean air, clean water, and such. So we have to acknowledge these are the important metrics that we need to be communicating, not, you know, what the price of gasoline is tomorrow, or whether GE stock went up or down, or, you know, who won the soccer game, or, you know, how much money LeBron James makes. I mean, those are all things that we hear. Those other things we hear about every day, but we don't hear about all those other material measurables that I discussed.
Absolutely correct. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to a special edition of the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rich, with our very, very special and insightful guest, Dr. Mayor. No, how's that work? Mayor Dr. Peter Schwartzman. Thank you very much. Peter, always a pleasure to talk to you, and you're a wealth of knowledge and insight and a credible source at that. That's why I actually had this event for tonight. Unfortunately, like Cosmo said, you can see behind me, not enough people care. So we need to change that somehow, some way. So I'm going to keep trying.
All right, everybody. You're one human. You're one human. You're one human. I'm one human. That's important.
It's true.
Very
Absolutely.
powerful.
100%. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Thoughts and ideas. Well, a single person can change the world. Don't think otherwise. It's happened many, many times. All right, folks. Thanks a lot for tuning in to the Illinois Green Party series. Till next time, be good, be green. Later.